Morning, team. It is another ATP geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce. This is a Ukraine war news update, first part thereof, for the 16th of December 2023. It's actually a somewhat quieter day, at least it will be for this first video. There's a few more things happening geopolitically. I've been hoping it's going to quieten down a little bit because it's been insane for the last week. There's been so much going on. I just haven't had time to gather myself, really. I have my boys' cup football match this morning, so just this one video and then I'll be off and then I'll complete the other videos when I get back. Let's see what the general staff figures say for the Russian losses for the day before. All the usual caveats apply. You can find them in the description to this video below. 930 personnel losses, still a pretty high number. Anywhere near 1,000 is your top end of the range, even though we have seen it at 1,300 plus over the last month or so. It is still an active front line, and I think that's active because the Russians are pushing in a number of places. They have been on the attack, particularly up in the very north, in the Sinkivka area, as well as obviously all the usual places like Avdiivka, Bakhmut, but also Novomykhailivka and Mariinka. So some real hotspots along the front line, and Krinky's been pretty painful for the Russians too. 14 tanks is a fairly high number of tanks to lose in a day. 13 APVs, has seen that go down, although that's still fairly significant. And just one artillery system. We have seen a number of days consecutively where artillery systems have not been high in that, well, losses have not been high in that category. And that is, I don't know what that says. I've been wondering whether the Russians really are running low on artillery pieces so that Ukrainians are finding them harder to target, or whether the weather is playing a large part. And the reason why you got higher numbers in the tanks and armored personnel vehicles is because the Russians are attacking with them. They're throwing them at Ukrainians. Ukrainians have to destroy them because they are being, they're being thrown at the front line, and they'll be destroyed by things like ATGMs and artillery and mines, rather than the artillery systems that really do require drones to spot them. That could be the explanation there. 11 vehicles and fuel tanks and one piece of special equipment, fairly low in those categories. So there's no anti-Perpetua list today, unfortunately. So we just go on and look at a few different bits and pieces to kind of support those numbers or sit alongside them. This was, I'm not going to show you all of this because it's pretty horrible. This is in Transcarpathia, Zakarpattia region, where a deputy detonated grenades in a building of a local village council. I think they're having a defense meeting for the village. So 26 people were injured, 6 are in serious condition, and the guy that actually dropped the grenades, I think, is possibly in the worst condition. Police qualified a grenade explosion in the building of the village council as a terrorist act. Motives of the terrorist deputy are still unknown. This is pretty incredible. He just walks into the building. And then just gets out his grenades and drops them. And he just drops these grenades on the floor. I can't show you any more after that. Literally comes in, drops the grenades on the floor in front of these people, and bang, they all go off. Terrible. And that's some guy, obviously, I presume he's a pro-Russian, just walking into a village council meeting where they're all discussing the defense implications, drops a bunch of grenades. Pretty terrible. Tataragami here doing another analysis of the Avdiivka losses, putting his number up to 211 visually confirmed losses in the Avdiivka direction. The last one was 109. I talked about this the other day, how the numbers have gone up. So there's almost a doubling of the official losses. But again, as I said previously, with some saying as many as 330 have actually been lost in the area. These are just the visually confirmed ones. And you might also get ones that are damaged and then towed away. And when the satellite comes over, they don't they don't sort of figure, or you get some that are towed away and others that might get destroyed at the same kind of place. And so there are lots of ways that these numbers can be somewhat inaccurate. But this is the real numbers will be at least this, right? So these are your benchmark minimum numbers for Avdiivka. I won't read through the whole thread, but it is interesting to read. Notably, not all confirmed FPV drone hits led to observable destroyed vehicles in satellite imagery. Some vehicles may remain operational or get evacuated for repairs, as mentioned. An FPV drone hit doesn't always indicate a vehicle loss. Around 50% of these losses occurred in the first 3 weeks of the offensive, with occasional peaks in the October to December period. This aligns with our earlier reports about a shift towards infantry assaults instead of massive mechanized troops. We excluded several locations recorded on videos where Russian vehicles were destroyed due to the extensive explosions. However, on the imagery, there was nothing left to identify as a vehicle other than a scorch mark and a crater. In other words, if they can only see a scorch mark and a crater, they don't include that as a lost vehicle, but they know from video evidence that there was a vehicle there that fundamentally exploded. So, there are more losses than the 211 shown in these satellite images and in this analysis by Tatarigami. It's just huge losses for the Russians there. And talking about huge losses, Krinky and surroundings have become a graveyard of Russian vehicles of all types. Ukrainians have lost very little equipment there, according to PS11. In this sense, the Krinky beachhead is an excellent operation for Ukraine. There's only one complaint. Robert Magyar is responsible for the large majority of those losses, and Ukrainian Marines haven't scored many kills, says PS11. So this was something I was talking about recently, how Krinky appears to be a little bit difficult for the Ukrainians because they're stuck there without the ability of expanding that bridgehead too much. And I said this is a worry because it could be like shooting fish in a barrel. The only way to look at this positively is if the equipment degradation of the Russian forces there and personnel losses for the Russians are at a ratio that is really still advantageous for the Ukrainians. Now, it might be attritional for the Ukrainians, but as long as they are taking those losses from the Russians, then it is worth having that bridgehead. And that does appear to be the case, at least intuitively. I can't be any more accurate than that, but it just seems like, and there is a bunch of evidence to suggest this. There's a lot of footage to suggest the Russians have lost an awful lot of vehicles in this area. You look at Andrew Perpetua's recent live streams and videos to kind of cement this idea that the Russians have lost a lot there. And the Ukrainians have been hit by a lot of aerial bombardments and whatnot. So the Ukrainians aren't going to have lost much equipment, though, if any, because they don't have any equipment across there. They've just got personnel. And so it might be attritional in terms of personnel for the Ukrainians, but in terms of the Russians, it's attritional in terms of equipment and therefore also personnel. You can add to that. Here in the Krinky area, a couple more of these Chinese Desert Cross vehicles.
What do you hold this?
These are the very light trucks, these I presume 4x4 trucks that the Russians are using more and more. We can see them in a number of places on the front line. The Chinese have provided literally, I think they're due to provide 1,500 and possibly an ongoing provision of these. They get away with doing that because they're not military vehicles, I guess, but they obviously kind of are, and that is a bit of a worry because the Russians are getting quite a lot of them. Now, here's something that's not to do with Ukraine particularly, but it's a military truck loaded with ammunition and weapons. It's burned down in Armenia, but it does belong to the Russian peacekeepers. Just to remind you that they still are over there in some capacity, and indeed losing some equipment there as well. Right, reports are coming in from Russia that a cargo train has been blown up in Melitopol. That's occupied Melitopol. Local channels report at 8 a.m. yesterday that Ukraine's resistance movement sabotaged a train transporting fuel and ammo from Crimea. I think there's been a concerted effort to hammer logistics and a number of different targets within occupied territories over the last 48 hours. It's been very active. reporting from Ukraine did a whole video on this morning, which you can go and look at to show that the Ukrainians really have been emphasizing or really concentrating, I guess, on hitting targets in occupied territories. We've not seen too much in terms of cruise missiles recently, and I don't know if many of these were cruise missiles, but there was certainly claims of ATACMS being used and HIMARS. They say it's the 11th successful sabotage of 2023 on railways in the occupied territories. This is really significant. If the partisans the saboteurs can do stuff like this, take out entire trains, then that is huge. I mean, it's sabotage. When I say take out, that could be very minimal damage, or it could be an entire train being blown up. Who knows? I mean, the claim here from Tim White is a train being blown up, cargo train being blown up. And that's good news for the Ukrainians if it is indeed as extensive as that. Richard Vareka from War Spotting does another one of his analyses looking at the types of vehicles that are being destroyed. Yet more evidence that Russia has run out of T-80s to reactivate, and those left on the battlefield are slowly being attrited away. The blue section below shows Russian T-80 losses as a percentage of each month's losses, and it has been shrinking every month since June. So here we have the T-80s in blue. T-72s, these older tanks, are becoming more and more prevalent in terms of the losses, percentage losses. We can see the T90s have gone down to virtually nothing. What does that say about the T90s? They only had 100 T90Ms. I forget how many T90s in total. It might be like 400 T90s, but we're not seeing many of these get lost at the moment. What does that say? And the other types sort of less significant. There's a few T62s and T55s. We've only seen one T55, I think, taken out. I don't know what this means going forward, that if more T72s are being destroyed, whether they are easier to refurbish back in Russia, whether they've got bigger stocks of the T72s. I believe the T80s are... they're quite fuel thirsty, aren't they? I think there are some issues with refurbishing them. So you might see these older and older tanks become... pick up more and more of the proportion of the tanks lost for the Russians. He goes on to say, looking at just T80 losses shows the T80U, blue in a graph, were the main type at the start. Then they ran out, replaced mostly by T80BVs. You can see, T80U, none of those there. And for what it's worth, I also think they've run out of easily reparable BMPs as well. And this is something I've been talking about a lot recently, how BMP-1s, let's see where they are. I don't know if they separate. Yeah, no, they don't separate the BMP-1s out. But we are seeing fewer and fewer BMPs being taken out in general. So more BMDs, BTRs, and so on and so forth. These are more modern vehicles. But also of the BMPs that have been taken out, very few BMP-1s in the last couple of weeks. And I've noted that to you. And in fact, that was something I think Richard Vareka had identified before. Right, moving on to strikes, standoff munitions and whatnot. Russia launched another fairly large Shahid drone attack. There were 31 launched, 30 of them were shot down. So another really good evening of interception for drones. I think Ukraine are in a very different air defense situation than they were some time ago, and Shahids are now struggling to find their targets. Maybe they keep sending them at these places where they know there are air defenses, to keep those air defenses there, and then it could be that they're going to switch to suddenly strike somewhere completely different and overwhelm it with Shahids. I don't know what the tactics are, but they are losing quite a lot of Shahids, a lot more than they used to, relatively speaking, in terms of proportion. There was an explosion heard near the center of Kyiv last night. That could well be a Shahid drone and almost certainly getting shot down. Kyiv is very difficult to successfully strike. However, what goes up must come down, as I keep saying. So even when Kyiv is attacked by Shahids and missiles and all of them get shot down, they get shot down into Kyiv. So it still causes problems, right? Tim White says Ukraine seems to have launched a concerted combined attack on occupied territories tonight. So that's last night. And this is going to what I was speaking about. The last 48 hours, I think this has been the case. Crimea was the main target, especially around the airfield in Jankoy. And what we have from reporting from Ukraine is that there have been these concerted attacks on, we have Mariupol here, we have the city of Donetsk, we have Henichesk, and we have Jankoy, and we have Crimea and Cape Tarkankut here. So there have been these attacks that the last 48 hours that have been, it appears that they've been pretty successful. Reporting from Ukraine was talking about one of these places having 15 missile attacks, and the Russians claiming all 15 were shot down. I think that's missiles, which is pretty significant, and yet only one of those was shown as being shot down on camera, and the rest appeared to be hitting their target. So this is something you hear quite a lot, which is the Russians claiming that that they successfully take out all of the Ukrainian missiles, and yet they don't often actually do that. And a number of bits of footage and whatnot to support the claims there from reporting from Ukraine. So yeah, it looks like Crimea was the main target, especially around the airfield of Jankoy, but also Donetsk and Kherson were under fire. This is Henichesk at the border with Crimea. So again, you have, and I think it was Henichesk where he was talking about one missile did seem to be taken down, but the rest appear to have found their target. So Henichesk being targeted there. Russia's MOD claims it destroyed 26 drones during the attack on occupied Crimea. Judging by smoke and ambulance reported, it was not a perfect evening for air defense. So again, the Russians claim they have this very well functioning air defense that takes out drones and missiles with a relative ease, but I think the reality is somewhat different. In a manner of speaking, it's pretty much confirmed now that Ukraine has struck oil in Donetsk. This is a second time an oil depot has been struck, and I think it must be causing the Russians some issue now. There was also an ammo depot struck in Donetsk, I believe. So that's two massive oil depots and an ammo depot as well. The logistics for the Russians is being hit, and also the Ukrainians continue to strike targets inside Russia. So this is Kursk and some more CCTV indicating a large explosion there. According to Russian Defense Ministry, air defense has shot down 4 airplane-type drones over the region. Of course, whether that is true, we won't know. Likely won't know, and the Ukrainians may have hit their target, or indeed may not. And Sevastopol and Jankoy, sorry, just more confirmation that there were explosions there last night. So reporting from Ukraine, that's a video worth looking at. Okay, moving on to other bits and pieces, not too much really to report. Here we have, and I don't know if you know, there is a gauge difference in railways between the Soviet era railways, including Ukraine, and the rest of Europe. And that means that when Ukraine receive aid or any kind of cargo from Europe, it has to be switched over before it hits the railways in Ukraine. Well, here, the way I understand this is that the Ukrainians have manufactured a grain carrier that can be used on both 1,520 mil and 1,435 mil gauge. So most of the components and materials for the car are manufactured in-house in Ukraine, and the grain carrier was manufactured by Ukrzaliznytsia production facility, so Ukrainian railways, and is maximally adapted for the transportation of goods across Ukraine and the gauge of 1435 European countries. It takes into account all the requirements, features and dimensions of the infrastructure. In the future, Ukrainian Railways plans to put the following railcars into mass production. And this is great. This just makes it a lot quicker to transport in this case, grain. So what would normally have to happen is you'd have grain loaded onto all of these carriers, onto all these hoppers, and then they'd be taken to the border. And then you've got to take all that grain out of those and put them onto another, put the grain into another carrier on a different gauge, or have containers that have to be offloaded and then loaded back onto another railway. Well, these can now just switch over. So I don't know whether the locomotives can do that at all, but certainly these carriers being able to do that, I think, will be super useful. It'd be great if you could get other beds that could do that so that some of the rolling stock, so that they could transfer military equipment from one railway gauge to another without having to shift the equipment from one whole cargo train to another. Anyway, just on to something else. Another Russian scientist who worked on supersonic and hypersonic technologies was arrested for treason. Not quite sure what's going on here, but it has happened over the last 6 months, whereby I think some of the people working on the Kinzhal missile were arrested, and you're trying to work out whether this is the Russians admitting the Kinzhals aren't operating to the claimed specifications, whether they have been a little bit disappointing, and as a result they're taking it out on the scientists and developers who have maybe made claims about the missiles that aren't exactly true. I don't know. That's me speculating, but it is interesting that they have arrested now. I think they arrested 2 or 3 previously, and here's another one. Finally, the Kyiv Independent reports on are Zelensky and his top general, that's Zaluzhny, really in discord. So it says, talking to the idea that Zelensky and Zaluzhny haven't been seen together in public for almost 2 months. The president appears to prefer the company of Zaluzhny's subordinates. This idea that he's going over Zaluzhny's head to speak to his subordinates rather than go through Zaluzhny. They openly disagree on the state of the war. Zaluzhny's stalemate comment in The Economist contradicted Zelensky's uncompromising public stance. Even more importantly, Zaluzhny is a political threat. Political support polls produced for internal use but recently leaked to the public list Zaluzhny as the only potential candidate to even come close to taking over from Zelensky. All of this is taking place with 2 major factors in the backdrop: Ukraine's unsuccessful counteroffensive and Zelensky's presidential term ending next year. While elections are technically postponed due to martial law, their possibility hangs in the air. The discord between Zelensky and Zaluzhny adds to the uncertainty of the coming year and risks undermining the country's unity, but it also may not be heated and nearing a breaking point as it may seem from the headlines. So this article says, it lays out all the issues, like you've just heard, goes into a bit more detail, but it says actually it's a little bit over-egged. So I think this might be trying to douse the flames of discontent here. And it just says at the end, are the tensions easing? Over a month down the line from Zaluzhny's divisive interview in The Economist, the tension seems to be easing, at least publicly. A sign of that came on the 12th, when Defense Minister Rustem Umerov, so he is Zelensky's guy, right, appointed by Zelensky, he's a government appointee, and so therefore is much more in line with Zelensky's thinking and desires. Well, he posted photos of him and Zaluzhny together decorating soldiers on Ground Forces Day, a professional military holiday, and they all seem pretty happy. The third person in the all smiles photo was Alexander Syrsky, the Ground Forces commander. Syrsky is one of the commanders Zelensky reportedly communicated with bypassing Zaluzhny. And then it goes on to say a little bit more, but finishes with, moreover, on the same day, Umerov dismissed any claims that the 2 countries' highest military commanders, Zaluzhny and Naiv, were on the verge of being dismissed. So there were these rumors kicking about. There is no such issue, Umerov told a joint briefing with the Latvian colleague, adding that the rotations of positions are normal for military operations. This idea is being artificially promoted both inside and outside Ukraine, he added. Now, it's worth remembering that I complain about Russian disinformation all the time, right? It is one of my bugbears. You can bet your bottom dollar that Russia will be amplifying any issues that exist inside Ukraine on the political and military landscapes, right? Anything that is to Russia's advantage, they will be amplifying. And so whatever the situation is, you can imagine that what you end up hearing about is probably worse than it really is. It's not to say there aren't issues that exist. It's not to deny that there are issues, but Russia will be amplifying anything like that. So just bear that in mind. Anyway, thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe and share. Relatively quiet today, all things considered. And I will get on and do my second recording when I get back. Toodle pips.